Well, thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to be talking about flipped classroom, and please feel free to ask me questions at any time. So, I would rather answer your questions than go through my slides. So please, do not hesitate to ask questions during the presentation. So one of the things that I think all of you know is that this model of learning, which says that you can just pour knowledge into students' brains, does not work. Students have to do their own thinking, and so we have to help students construct that understanding. This is what all of the cognitive science is saying, and this is what we should be thinking about as educators. So what's the flipped classroom model? In this model, the traditional in-class activities and out-of-class activities are flipped. So here I'm showing instructional things, and above this axis is what happens in class, and below this axis is out of class. And in a traditional class, what happens is inside of the class there are lectures in which students acquire knowledge, or they are supposed to, and then out of class they are practicing applying those concepts in diverse situations. And then of course they get graded and they get feedback hopefully later on from the instructor. In the flipped class, students are doing acquisition of knowledge outside of class. So, you might have posted videos, video lectures, or multimedia modules, and maybe you are even asking students to read some papers and other things, and students have to do some pre-quizzes. I mean, generally that's the way flipped classes work. They work best if you also have pre-quizzes where students have to answer questions based upon what they have learned, so that they come prepared to class, and here they are in class where they are being coached. So students are actually working with other students, and they are learning to apply things, and they are discussing things with the instructor, and the instructor is providing feedback to the students. And then of course there's again this part where students practice more at home, the kinds of things that they have already practiced to some extent at home, in order to develop self-reliance and confidence that they can do it all by themselves. So I don't think we have clickers here, so I was going to ask you a clicker question if we had clicker here, but let me actually ask you this question anyway, and I would like each person to talk to a person next to them. What do you think is the biggest hurdle to flipping your class? I have 5 choices here. I do not have the time to think about the correct pedagogy. Flipped classes are mostly hype. They are not worth the time I would have to spend to implement them. My student evaluations will likely go down. I am not comfortable using active engagement techniques. None of these, so you have some other thing in your mind. Please talk to a person next to you about, if you haven't used flipped classes, you can still think about what might be the biggest, barrier.
I don't do much class.
So how many people actually think that they don't have the time? It's the time that is the constraint. They don't have the time to think about correct pedagogy. Anybody? Okay. All right. What about, you people thinking that it might just be hype and it really doesn't help that much in terms of helping students learn better? Okay. What about student evaluations being a concern? How about like not being comfortable in general with actively engaging students? All right, other options? Okay, good. So you can see that there are all kinds of things. And by the way, if we did have clickers, the good thing about that would be that all of these responses would first of all be anonymous. which is a good thing because here we can actually see who's raising hand, and they may not want to raise their hand for any of these options, right? Especially when you are asking it in the classroom context where the answers might be right or wrong. Here there is no right and wrong answer, but in some other cases, you might be talking about things in which there might be a right and wrong answer, and it might be good to keep it anonymous, in which case clickers could be a great resource. The other thing about clickers is that you have the feedback from students for yourself, and you can think about all of the things that students said later to think about how you can actually help students with those kinds of things, maybe in the next class or in the future. So I think, just having responses from the students about different kinds of things is actually a good thing for the instructor in thinking about how to help them in future. So it's a great tool for formative assessment, helping students do better in the future.
Are you using cell phones as substitutes for clickers?
So that is a good point. So now, these days, cell phones are being used instead of clickers. I think it is up to instructors. I mean, I think over time, cell phone usage will go up in order to give feedback to the instructor about these kinds of questions. The only problem with cell phone is that all of the research, at least I know in the discipline of physics, is showing that 1/4 to 1/3 of the students who are allowed to use cell phones to answer these kinds of questions can actually get disengaged and start doing something else at some point or the other in that class period. This is what the research is showing. So if you think that that's all right, then you can use, cell phones to have students answer questions, because now there are these cloud-based, software that you can put on your computer to get feedback from the cell phones from the students. So yes, your students don't have to buy that $40 clicker if you let them use the cell phones, although there is a problem. Hi, Dr. Spegnolati. All right, so then I wanted to actually, before I talk about flipped classes, the way we use them in physics, and that's being used in other departments in arts and sciences, I wanted to talk about some of the common formats that digital technology is being used in education, because I just wanted to make a distinction between what I'm talking about and what are the similarities too. So you must have heard about massive open online courses, or MOOCs. And then there are obviously online courses, which are not necessarily massive or open, and then flipped classes, and then blended or hybrid classes. So what are MOOCs? Well, these are things that are free to take for everybody, and they are hosted on an online platform such as edX, Coursera, Udacity. So Pitt has partnership with Coursera. So if you want to do a MOOC, you would be actually doing it on Coursera right now, because that's what we have partnership with. Now, you can see that since these kinds of courses are actually free for anybody to take, and they are hosted by these external platforms, the entire course must be finished before the launch day. They are not going to take responsibility for starting your course if you say, oh, I'm done with it half, and why don't you start it, and then the rest of the thing I'm going to do as the course proceeds. They don't want to take responsibility for that. They think that their reputation is at stake. They want the entire thing finished before you start. It's true, when I say entire thing finished, I still want to say that you can actually tweak things like discussion boards and things like that. So what happens, there is also this chat and discussion that's going on, just like the way we do it in Blackboard. And those kinds of things you can actually adapt as the course is going. You can actually have TAs or yourself involved in those discussions or not involved in those discussions, because it's free for everybody, and you're not really that responsible for investing a lot of time after the course is launched, but you can if you want to. Now, the great thing about these, and in these courses, again, you can post online videos and things like that, or have students read things. There are assignments and everything. You can have assignments, that students do and turn in, which other students grade. You can have some rubric for how people will grade each other's assignment. I think that the greatest thing about MOOCs is what we are going to learn about teaching and learning online, and how we can adapt it in other kinds of formats such as flipped classes. Why do I say that? Because these platforms are really very good about keeping track of all the student data. That kind of data, I don't rely on my Blackboard thing for this kind of data. In fact, I can't even really tell what fraction of my students are actually necessarily watching all the videos, because some weeks it'll say everybody has watched, and another week it might say nobody has watched, when the students are saying to me, I have watched it. So I don't think that our Blackboard is reliable in terms of like usage. That aspect I don't think is reliable, but these ones are. So you can really learn a lot about how often have students worked on their homework, who has done it, what resources are they using or not using, how often are they rewinding certain sections of the videos, and, what is so special about those things, what demographics actually, does do this, and what fraction of people drop out. So these kinds of things are actually relevant even for flipped classes. That's what I'm saying. And some of the things that you might have developed for a MOOC can actually be transferred to a regular flipped class that you're teaching for your own students. By the way, I want to say that I went to the edX website and I saw that there were 26 MOOCs right now on medical education. So and this is the total number at edX website at least. So medical schools are putting up MOOCs over there. And now, what was the motivation for putting these free resources? Well, that's the saddest thing about MOOCs, actually, in my opinion. So basically, the original goal of these MOOCs and making it available to everybody in the world was to actually do something altruistic and give people opportunity to learn about things for free, people who may not have the resources to actually go to college. Unfortunately, it turns out that if you look at the data from the MOOCs, you find that, the retention rate on average is like 5%, right? So tens of thousands of people will actually register for these MOOCs, and then only 5% on average will survive. And even amongst those people, most of these people who are surviving are people who already have a degree, who already have a college degree. So in other words, they want to actually, enhance their skills. They maybe want to learn more about economics, finance, physics, whatever else. But the point is, these are people who already have the skills, and the ones who don't, we still need to think very hard about how to engage them better. And in fact, the recent data is showing, and this is also relevant for your flipped classes, that what will actually get people who do not have the ability to actually survive in these, the only way that you will be able to actually keep them there is if you actually provide good opportunities during the discussions. How are you making it part of a community? If they don't feel like they're part of a community, if they don't feel like they're actually going with everybody else and, they're learning something from other people, people from underrepresented groups are very likely to drop out, because the survival rate of underrepresented groups in these MOOCs is very, very small, and people who are not already have a college degree. So online courses are similar to MOOCs, but of course there is cost for enrolling, and the entire course doesn't need to be ready, and you are responsible for answering students' questions in this case, because students are paying for it, and you can have synchronous sessions and office hours if you like, where you actually can talk to the students if they have difficulties. I already talked about the flipped classes, which is what I'm going to focus on today. Now, there are also blended and hybrid classes in which some of the things might be flipped and some things are not flipped, right? So you don't have to flip your entire class. Some of the classes can be flipped. Now, one thing that cognitive science is telling us is that any model of learning, if it is going to be effective for majority of the students, it is really important that you are able to map it onto this model, which is called the cognitive apprenticeship model. So it is a field-tested model. What are the important aspects of this model? There are three important components. One is called modeling. It means that the instructor should model or exemplify and demonstrate the skills that he or she wants his or her students to learn. The second aspect in cognitive apprenticeship model is coaching and scaffolding. Instructors should provide guidance, practice, and support in order for students to learn these skills. And then there is weaning or fading the support. So you need to actually let students do more of the things and reduce the support so that they develop self-reliance, they become confident about things. So if you cannot map your teaching to this model, then most likely there is something not very effective about it. So notice that this model is not saying exactly what you should be doing. It's saying that there should be all of these aspects, these three aspects in your teaching. So I have a question for you here. It says, which one of the three important components of cognitive apprenticeship model is commonly missing from traditional instruction? Modeling, coaching and scaffolding, or fading or weaning the support? Can you talk to a person next to you about this? Yeah, there is a right answer for this, actually. Please talk to. Yeah.
Sounds negative. Maybe coaching not like what she's saying.
As I understand it, would be like you treat a third year resident differently than you treat a second. But especially if you're
Yeah, maybe that is the right example.
All right, so how many people think that modeling is missing? Okay, how about like coaching and scaffolding? All right, what about fading the support? All right, it turns out, okay, so it looks like that there isn't a right answer, at least here. What I was going to say is that in majority of, actually to some extent, I mean, all of these things can be done better. So in other words, oftentimes modeling could be a problem in the sense that we do not explicitly model the criteria of good performance. So for example, in a physics class, you know, I may not be really focusing on the difficulties of the problem, or I may be doing problem solving where all students see is some formulas, you know, and not why those principles are applicable in those situations. And in that case, I'm not modeling it very well, because it's actually the initial qualitative analysis of a problem. It's actually the planning of the solution that is really the most important thing about the problem. You know, if you have done those things, you've solved 80% of the problem. Just implementing some plan and plugging and chugging is not really the most important aspect of problem solving. So in that sense, if all of the initial analysis and planning and, you know, and decision making is being done by instructor in his or her head, that's not a very good way to model problem solving. So obviously that kind of thing is lacking. But what I was going to say is that this coaching and scaffolding aspect is really missing from traditional instruction, in that, you know, if you think about it, we lecture and then we expect students to go home and do their thing. As it's like saying, okay, let me play the piano for you, and then you go home and you do it because you saw me playing it and it made perfect sense. It doesn't work that way. Cognitive apprenticeship model says that, you know, just like, for example, if a tailor is teaching his or her kid how to do sewing, you know, if he'll first show, okay, here, let me show you how to cut this thing and then how to stitch it. And then when the kid is starting to do it, there might be obstacles along the way because you haven't learned things. And then he has to say, no. Feedback is really important. Coaching is really important. You have to let them do it. And then every time they make a mistake, you have to say, no, this should have been before this because of this problem. See, do you see that there is this happening? So after some, and of course you reduce the support, you fade the support so that, you know, they develop self-reliance. The idea of cognitive apprenticeship model, which is a very, you know, well-tested model in many different contexts, is that this coaching and scaffolding is really important, because you cannot just expect to model something for students and have them go home and practice it as though they have learned it. Your feedback, your support, and, you know, students working themselves and struggling is really important. And by the way, all of the research is also showing that struggling is an important part of learning. If you have done all of the work for students, they are not going to really learn very well. So struggling and coaching and scaffolding, that's the time that students are struggling. In fact, my own research, if you read some of the, actually this paper that you mentioned about self-diagnosis, one of the things that we find in that is that if students are self-diagnosing their mistakes, using an approach in which they struggle the most, That's the intervention in which students do the best in the final exam if you have controlled the groups of students, as opposed to, say, for example, as soon as they solve a problem, you immediately give them a solution which has like all the problems worked out in gory detail, and all you say to students, okay, find your mistake. Students might just say, oh, I have a minus sign wrong and I forgot the R or something, but they may not engage with it in a very deep manner. But if you say, okay, you go home, or you actually look at your books and notes and try to figure it out, what you did wrong, what we find is that students in that case are struggling, but they are really thinking through things with their peers, and afterwards they really want to know what was wrong with what they had done, and later they do a lot better. Of course, all of this stuff needs to be, discussed with students. They need to know that struggling is the stepping stone to actually learning something, so that is actually inevitable. That's a good thing. If they are struggling, they've already gotten somewhere. But please.
The research that you're talking about, can you comment on the extent to which it's been done with undergraduates as opposed to graduate students?
So that is a really good point, and I have to say that my own research, actually, this was not the one that was pointed out, but I also do research in how to help students learn quantum mechanics at the upper level undergraduate level. So these are seniors, physics seniors generally, and juniors and seniors, and what we find is that the same kind of thing is true even with those students. So these are physics majors, and even in those classes, what we find is that if you actually have students struggle, that is a really good thing. If you're interested, you can send me an email and I'll send you references to those papers so that you can see that it is a good thing for you to actually have students self-diagnose things, but that self-diagnosis should actually make students struggle. So
that's not what I'm trying to get.
Please.
It's more the point that the graduate students are a highly self-selected group of students who probably, since most people don't teach as systematically as you might, who have perhaps mastered these skills, that they know that they need to go through that stuff. So the extent to which, when you realize that they might be different.
So I guess, let me repeat the question because you may not have heard what he's saying. So he's saying that, is it true that undergraduate students are different from graduate students in that graduate students already have the skills, to say, for example, do problem solving, do good reasoning, they have good metacognitive skills, and by metacognitive skills, I mean, this thing about what did I wrong, what mistake did I make, why did I make this mistake, how can I do it better next time, how would I know that this is the principle of physics that I should have used in this situation, because maybe I got it wrong this time. Believe it or not, what we are finding at least is that even amongst the upper level undergraduate students and graduate students, even graduate students in physics, there is a huge diversity, and not all of the people are actually doing these things the way you think they would be doing. Okay? Another research that is very relevant is that it's possible that motivation is a concern too, right? And you might say, okay, but these students should be more motivated than other ones. Again, there is a big diversity even over there, and research has shown that if you actually plan your class, for example, your flipped class, in such a way that you're focusing on the kinds of things that students should be learning, and all of the class time is being spent in students actually dealing with the kinds of things that they have found difficult and during the out-of-class activities. So maybe they watched some lectures and this and that, and you gave them some pre-class activities, and looking at the responses to those pre-class activities, now you know how to design your in-class activities, and you're making students work together. And even if these students had said earlier at the beginning of the term, in terms of their interest in the course, that they were not very interested compared to they were very interested, what people have found is that there is no difference in the student performance if you make them engage with the material in the way that would help them actually organize their knowledge, repair their knowledge structure, and extend their knowledge structure. So the point is that how you actually teach the flipped class has big implications for how students learn, even if they may not have had intrinsic motivation at the beginning to begin with. And again, if you need the reference, I can send it to you. So in the flipped class format, and oftentimes we call it just-in-time teaching, the reason I like to call, and I'm not the only person, this term was actually coined long time ago in physics, and just-in-time teaching, and it basically refers to the fact that in these kinds of flipped classes, you have given to students out-of-class activities that they do, and then they answer these pre-quiz questions that you can access, say, through CourseWeb before the class, and then you look at what are the difficult things for students, and then those are the kinds of things that you design the in-class activities around. Of course, the in-class activities work best if you put students in small groups where they can actually take advantage of each other's strengths also. In fact, my own research also in that regard shows that even if you don't provide any help to students in class, and you just tell them to work with each other, and you see that students actually did not do well in the pre-quizzes before the group work, they are able to figure things out while working with each other. And so I call this co-construction of knowledge. So that means students, if I don't know something and you don't know something and we are put together, we can figure things out. In fact, one of the research studies that was published in 2003 or something that we did, we found that in 30% of the cases, students were co-constructing knowledge in these kinds of peer interactions in which they didn't even have any feedback from the instructor. Of course, you know, the flipped classes work the best if you're actually going around and you're facilitating the discussion so that you actually don't see that a lot of students actually are completely stuck. But I'm just, please.
Is there an optimal size for that kind of class?
For the flipped class?
For this kind of like hybrid model.
So,
I imagine if you have 80 people, two or too small. There's an optimal size.
okay, so just like, you know, in the case of recitations, you know, like people say that anything less than 40, up to 40 works best because it's easier to facilitate that kind of thing. Unfortunately, at Pitt, in my own department right now, for example, we have 2 flipped classes and both of them have more than 100 students. So, that's because of the university constraints, you know, like we have to teach large classes in physics, so we have these classes which are flipped in which we have more than 100 students. That I would say they're still working quite well, and in fact all of the preliminary data that we have from those classes, because in fact one of the instructors is teaching a flipped class and a traditional class, and he's also giving the same kinds of assessments in all of these, and so far what we have found is that flipped class is working quite well actually. So I think the point is that even in these large classes, if you have things like clickers, you can still engage students. It's true that the classroom structure is such that the students can only talk to the people who are sitting next to them. But you know, even in that class, I mean, if you design good clicker questions, and yes, they are in the multiple choice format, but I can tell you, if you think very hard about designing these clicker questions, and as a community, you know, medical school people can come up with good clicker questions for a particular course. You know, that's what we are doing in physics. You know, for example, there are good clicker questions for electricity and magnetism, mechanics, you know, quantum mechanics, everything else, right? So the point is, if you come up with those kinds of things, they can be at higher level on Bloom's taxonomy. By higher level, I mean, you know, Bloom's taxonomy, I'm not sure if you're familiar with, you know, it talks about taxonomy of cognitive achievement. So you can have low-level things which are more informational, or you can have things where students have to apply knowledge, they have to analyze things, they have to synthesize different things and put it together, they have to compare and contrast things, or they have to critique certain things, you know, validity of certain things. Those kinds of things, you know, are at all different levels, and you can come up with multiple choice questions that deal with all of those different things, because one of the constraints of the clickers is that the best way to get feedback from all of the students is via these multiple choice questions. But you can come up with those questions, and actually that's what's happening in those flipped classes. A lot of time is being spent on that, and even in problem solving, the way it's being done is 3 students are solving quantitative problems, and then there are some multiple choice answers given there, and you have to select one of them. So it is working quite well in that regard, even in the context of, say, 130 or 140 student classes. So as I said, so in this thing, the main delivery of information is out of class, and people have tried different formats. Like, for example, in the physics classes that we are trying, in one case, all of the videos are posted. In another case, students are actually trying to read the material from the textbook itself, and they're doing the pre-class quizzes, because that could be another model. You don't necessarily have to have the videos. And we are also trying to see the effectiveness of different kinds of videos too. You can have a video in which there's only voice over PowerPoint, and maybe annotation. Or you can have videos, that students watch outside that could have an instructor. And in fact, if you look at the principles of multimedia learning by Richard Meyer, in fact, Richard Meyer was here last year, actually. CIDD had invited him, and it was a good presentation on multimedia learning. And what he was saying is that all of the research is showing that you shouldn't have, say, for example, a person talking and the written thing simultaneously on the side. That is very distracting. And in fact, there is no evidence that a person talking is better than voice over PowerPoint. So far, that's what we are finding in research, that voice over PowerPoint is equally good. And in fact, it's worse if there is voice and written thing at the same time. So that doesn't work. By written thing, I mean, let's say that you're trying to explain some diagram. It's better you just talk about it, or you have the thing written. If you have both of it, somehow the way cognition works, people are getting distracted between the two things, and that group doesn't do well. The group that is provided written, feedback and also verbal feedback. Students kind of are confused about those kinds of things. So anyway, in this flipped class, in-class activities obviously should be promoting this coaching and feedback, coaching and scaffolding. And by scaffolding, I mean providing feedback and support, where the support slowly decreases. So in our classes, we use clicker questions. These are this think, pair, share. And by the way, when I say clicker questions, it's really important to have students also talk to each other, because there's so much they can learn from each other. You will see a big improvement in student performance when they actually share their ideas and think about why is it correct. And then, of course, there should be a general class discussion about why these things are the way they are. If suppose there is a right answer, then you as an instructor can summarize in the end what happens. By the way, and this also, this flipped class, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be anything that the instructor should do. You can even summarize things as a 5-minute lectures, even in a flipped class, and that is fine. Because if you look at Bransford and Schwartz's theory of, Bransford and Schwartz, they are cognitive scientists, of learning, of scaffolding, one of the things they say is that lectures are not bad if all of the students are primed to learn from lecture. So in other words, they have this thing called a time for telling. They have written a really nice paper that is, the title of that paper is A Time for Telling. And the reason it's relevant for flipped classes is because you as an instructor still have this role where you have to guide students, you have to provide feedback. But once students have struggled through these kinds of things by working on these things themselves, whether they are clicker questions, collaborative problem solving, whatever, if they are working on those kinds of things, you can still summarize things for them. And now that they have struggled, this is a good time for learning, because everybody is primed to learn that thing. So if I start teaching something, and start saying, oh, here are capacitor plates, this is 1 volt, this is 2 volt, this is 3 volt, what will be the work done going from here to there, or what's the electric field? Half of the people don't even know why I'm talking about this. But if I have made students think about those things, if they have actually, tried to solve problems related to that and struggled with it, and then I'm summarizing why certain things are a certain way, that's a good time for telling. And that is what Bransford and Schwartz have shown. They've shown that when you control for the kinds of students that you have in terms of their prior grades and things, and you actually make them struggle with some activities appropriately. These activities should not be so difficult that everybody gives up, nor should it be so easy that there is no struggle, because then they get disengaged too. So they say that there should be element of innovation and efficiency built into the kinds of activities that you're doing, for example, in these flipped classes. And in that case, there will be students who will really make an effort to think through these things. And at some point, if you summarize things at the end, Now everybody is primed to learn, as opposed to only a few students who are like, yes, I really want to learn physics, I'm here, front seat. In this case, when you have made everybody do these kinds of things, and then you are lecturing a little bit, it's not a bad thing, because everybody is going to benefit from it after having struggled with those things. Please.
I'm sure this depends on the material and the individual student, but what would you say is an optimal amount of out-of-classroom activity prior to a flipped classroom approach?
Okay, so the question was, what is an optimal amount of out-of-class activity, for a flipped class? So here is the thing. If you're doing a flipped class, you can potentially have less class time. So in general, so for example, in my department, some of those flipped classes actually have only half of the time in class. So half of the time is outside. So in other words, generally, if we have 4 hours of physics class, this is only going to be 2 hours in class and 2 hours outside, because you're actually watching the videos.
1 to 1 kind of thing? 1 hour for 1 hour?
So if that's the way you have done it, I mean, different people do it different ways, because, some of these things are really hybrid more than flipped. But the way we do it, we actually have 2, hours of outside of class thing for 2 hours inside. This is something that is only for how much do you do for to make up for all the things that they missed in class. But in addition to this, they have to do everything else. So the heuristic that we have at Pitt and everywhere else is that for every hour of in-class thing, you should really be doing overall 3 to 4 hours. So I'm not talking about that aspect. That's true for all classes, right? Students are asked to do out-of-class work for 3 to 4 hours for every hour of in-class thing. This is the general heuristic. I'm saying 2 hours of outside plus 2 hours of inside for a class of 4 hours. That's the way we do it in physics, and many other places also they are doing it this way when they flip the class. Any other questions, please?
Yeah, so what's the difference between think, pair, share, and collaborative problem solving?
Okay, so think, pair, share, this term generally is used for shorter things. So collaborative problem solving, at least maybe in the physics literature, the way we talk about it, think, pair, share could be just what I made you do, for example. Like when I said to you, what do you think could be the biggest barrier to using technology? Or which of these aspects of this cognitive apprenticeship model of learning, which cognitive scientists are saying should be an important component of any instruction? I said, think about it and then talk to a person next to you and share your ideas. That's think, pair, share, because it's a shorter activity, so you can do it several times in one 50-minute class. Collaborative problem solving could be a longer thing, so you can really say, okay, here is a physics problem, you have 10 minutes to do it. And again, if you have a large class, you can still do it. And the way we are doing in our flipped classes is we put up 5 answers, so maybe the answers are 30 Newton, 300 Newton, 3000 Newton, and they are sufficiently far away that you can actually, if you got the ballpark answer, you're good enough. If you figured out how to do it without calculator, that's fine. But there are answers provided. So collaborative problem solving, generally, it takes a little bit longer time. You might give them 10, 15 minutes to do those things. Maybe, I'm not saying that these words are necessarily the same, words that you would use in medical school. This is what we use in physics. But generally, these things are shorter questions for us. I mean, don't take it too seriously. I'm just saying it's more about engaging students, having students take advantage of each other's strengths. And in a flipped class, we are really providing students a lot of opportunity for thinking with each other. Now, also homework should build on in-class activities. So basically, as I said, in a flipped class, you give students pre-quizzes. Those pre-quizzes, you can check students' responses the previous evening or something, and then design the class according to it. I have to say one thing. If you're thinking this is too hard, it's not. Because of the fact that student difficulties are very common. Again, this is something that cognitive science tells us, that students are not going to have 3,000 different reasons for why they don't understand Newton's third law. So if everybody's, if people are struggling with why a huge trailer truck doesn't exert a large force on a small car, and the forces are equal and opposite, which is what Newton's third law says, it is because they are confusing acceleration and force. So it's true that the acceleration of the small car is going to be larger, and it might get smashed. But the forces are going to be equal and opposite. You know, the accelerations are different because the masses are different, right? So it's the acceleration that actually makes the difference in terms of what crashes and, you know, what really gets impacted by this collision. But the point is that, you know, people's difficulties are not that, you know, different. It's not that 6 billion people on this planet are going to think 6 billion different ways about some case that you give to them to think about. They're going to think about, if they are not thinking about it in the right way, their thought processes are going to actually go in very predictable directions. Maybe you can classify it in 3 or 4 categories. So if you actually already have done the flipped class one time and looked at students' responses before class, in the pre-class quizzes, and thought about how to incorporate it, you can predict that in the future years, even if you don't look at students' responses and keep the activities and just tweak them a little bit, it will still work, because students are going to have similar kinds of difficulties with those kinds of materials, because human sense making has a pattern to it. You know, people try to overgeneralize based upon what they have seen, you know, so people will say, oh yeah, if an object is moving at a constant velocity, that must have a net force on it, and it doesn't. Velocity doesn't mean force, right? Only if the velocity is changing, there is a net force. But again, you can see why they would think that way, because in order to get something started, you do need a force. So that's why people think that, oh, higher velocity means higher force. And that's not the case. So you can see that most of the students are going to have very similar problems. Please. Somebody had a question there?
I was going to say, is that basically why a lot of times you see senior experienced teachers, they have modules in their minds for students, because they just know that about this time in class or this time of year, on the average, they're going to have the same problems because they've seen them happen over and over. People are definitely in the same state.
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say senior or junior. I'm not going to say that senior people are necessarily going to be better instructors than junior people, but if the senior person is very, you know, cognizant of putting himself or herself in students' shoes and thinking about the difficulties based upon what they have actually gotten from the students, they could potentially actually tailor their instruction to suit those things. And that is what you do in flipped classes, because you can actually ask students to answer questions based upon the pre-class readings, and based upon what difficulties were found, you can actually focus on those kinds of things. By the way, one thing that I wanted to say is that related to what you're saying, is that teaching is not really about just knowing content. You know, I could know physics very well and still not be a good teacher of physics. You know, it's really about thinking that it's not about me, it's about the students, thinking about putting myself in students' shoes and thinking about the difficulty of the problem from their perspective. In fact, oftentimes, it could be that if you're not thinking about difficulty of students from their perspective, the fact that, you know, as you learn, your brain changes. You know, you guys are medical, you know, you guys are doctors, so you really know that brain really goes through actual changes when you are learning new things. And so if you're not really cognizant of the fact that your students are not where you are, you can really underestimate their difficulties. You can really actually not focus on the kinds of difficulties that they are having. And flipped classes are really designed to focus on those kinds of things. You know, what are the things that they couldn't do on their own? They're saying this is the most challenging thing for them. If you do those kinds of things in class, and also have students take advantage of each other's strengths. I mean, as I said, my own studies show that students co-construct knowledge in all kinds of classes. We have seen this even with graduate students. You know, the paper that I wrote a long time ago was for undergraduates, but now we are seeing the same kind of co-construction happening even in physics graduate student population. So students can actually learn so much from each other, have them take advantage of this community, you know, and the fact that they're not so far away from each other. If you know something and I don't know, you actually might even have a better way to explain it to me than an instructor, you know, whose brain has changed, and, you know, for 40 years, you know, the person hasn't really learned the thing, you know, hasn't thought about this kind of thing. They may not understand, you know, where are you coming from? In fact, there is this beautiful research by Elaine Seymour and Nancy Hewitt, and they summarized it in a book called Talking About Leaving. And they did studies with more than 350 undergraduate students who had declared STEM majors, engineering or physical sciences or biological sciences even, I can't remember, but it was mainly engineering and sciences, and what they found is that all these students, mostly from underrepresented groups, when they were actually leaving, they said, I'm leaving because I go to the instructor and the instructor keeps repeating, even though I say I don't understand this thing, they keep repeating the same thing every time I ask them the question, and that means I must be stupid, so I'm not good enough to do this thing, so I'm just switching to English major or something like that, communication. I mean, the point, no, seriously, no, actually it's worth thinking about, because actually it is not the students' fault. We really need to think about things, because I don't believe that people cannot do physics, most people cannot do physics if we actually teach them well. We are not doing a good job of teaching physics, and so people are, and also another thing that Nancy Hewitt and Elaine Seymour found is that women and underrepresented students are much more likely to doubt their own abilities. This is there in the air, this is societal, but then people themselves start, undervaluing them too. So they start, having these self-efficacy issues because the instructor is repeating the same exact thing over and over again, and not really thinking about putting themselves in the student's shoes and thinking about the difficulty of the problem from student's perspective. That's the important thing. Why is this student having difficulty? If they are thinking that huge trailer truck should always exert a larger force, which is wrong, on the small car, instructor needs to think about where is this coming from. And many people don't think about it. They're like, Newton's third law says this. Who cares about what Newton's third law says? Think about what your students are saying and why are they thinking about it. Can you actually put yourself in students' shoes and think about it? And in flipped classes, when you put students to work with each other, they help each other because they are closer to each other than you are. And oftentimes that's why students can help each other much better than the instructor can. The kinds of questions that we ask students in our flipped classes are these kinds of things. What was the most challenging thing you learned in the web lecture or multimedia module? What was the most interesting thing you learned? This key idea is similar in ways to that other idea. What are the important similarities? What are the important differences? Under what circumstances can we use these kinds of concepts or skills? What are some of the circumstances in which they don't apply? Or, this key idea has the potential to help millions of people. Are there also disadvantages to it if implemented inappropriately? Can you give examples of how this idea applies in certain situation? Earlier you solved problems using this thing. What new problems can you solve using this, and what could you not do that you couldn't do using the old ones? Or you can ask some questions in the multiple choice format. You can ask them to rank certain things in the order of certain kind of property. What people have found is that if you have these pre-quizzes in the flipped classes that are actually conceptual, those are much better. Those are much better. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't have quantitative problems in the homework. Remember, everybody, whether it's flipped or not, they're still doing some standard homework as well. But if your pre-quizzes, if they are of this kind, they will give you feedback. If you're looking at it night before because this is the first time you taught this kind of a class, you can tell, oh, this is what I should have done. But this is what I should be doing in my class because I can see that most people are struggling with the answer to this question or something like that. This is going to give you cues as to how to design your flipped class for in-class activities. You see what I'm saying? This is going to be a good way to design your in-class activities, please.
Are you going to comment on how one optimally designs the out-of-class material in contrast to a traditional lecture, or is it?
Okay, so his question was, what about like how to design out-of-class things as opposed to what you do in class? So as I said, people do flip classes in many different ways, and many people are developing these video modules. And the video modules, generally people recommend, the rule of thumb is do not make it more than 15 minutes. So it's even better if you actually make it less than that. 5 to 10 minutes is even better. What do I mean by that? So it's possible that before class, students may actually look at a video module that might be even more than one module, but between all of those, there should be these pre-lecture activities. You know, you have to have some questions about each of these things. So they watch for something for 5 minutes, and then there are these pre-lecture questions. When students answer them, these kinds of things, it gets uploaded on CourseWeb. You know, so maybe they type their answer, they actually answer these multiple choice questions. So CourseWeb is good for these kinds of things. You can actually have students answer these questions, and then when they upload it, you can actually see what each student has done. Then they can go on to the next module and next module. So generally, people's attention span is such that they say that never make a video that is more than 15 minutes. The shorter, the better in some sense, you know, like, so 5 minutes is even better. Also, in addition to these pre-lecture modules, you should also have some other things that you want students to do. Like, for example, you can give students some tutorials to do. You can, in medical school, by the way, you know, you guys have these simulations that I think could be very good things for students to do, right? I mean, those, what are they called? Sorry, what are they called?
Sometimes it's like problem-based learning.
Yeah, so problem-based learning, but I was trying to think about that simulator that you guys have that is being used for education and different things. I mean, even those kinds of things, students can actually do outside of class. So it's not that, you know, like you have to have everything in terms of these mini lectures and then some pre-quizzes in addition to the traditional homework that you might give to all the students anyway, even in a traditional class. You can also have students, for example, work on these multimedia modules, like, for example, these simulation of some cases, right? Case studies or problem-based learning. So people are trying to diagnose different things. And from what I understand in medical school, the only reason that thing is not being used a lot in class is because people are thinking, oh my God, it's going to take a lot of class time. Make students do those kinds of things outside of class, and then they enter their response on CourseWeb for what they have come up with for the diagnosis for the particular case that thing is talking about. And there are certain, it's also a tutorial thing. It tells you a little bit about how to proceed with things. And then at that point, when you as an instructor see what students are actually able to do, you can actually design the class activities that focuses on the kinds of difficulties that students are having. So if it's about some case related to, you know, who knows, somebody having certain kind of problem, and if everybody is thinking that it should have this kind of a treatment or this symptom means that or whatever, then if you think that it should be structured in a certain way in class and to help students think better about these issues, then you can do that. So I'm not saying that only pre-lecture things are the only kinds of things that you can actually do. In addition to videos and pre-quizzes, you can also have students work with these kinds of multimedia modules outside of class and then have discussion in class about the kinds of things that students were having difficulty with. You know, what was the difficult thing about this case? Why did the students not do well on it? All right, so I mean, like, you know, as I said, in physics, we use clickers a lot, and it actually counts for their grade. And but you don't have to use clickers. The good thing about the clickers is that it actually, you know, gives you feedback about what students have learned, and it also helps students see what kinds of things you desire of them. What kinds of questions do you want students to be able to do? You know, so if I want them to be able to understand, because a lot of people might think, oh, she wants us to know about acceleration, so that means only rate of change of velocity with time. But no, maybe I want students to know that, oh, a car is going this many miles an hour, that many hours, what's the average acceleration of the car over this period? So then you also actually have students think through the kinds of skills that you want them to develop, and that is an important thing too. And in a flipped class, you can do it really well. Here I wanted to show you how in my own flipped class, class, clicker questions really have helped improve student learning. This is the percentage of students, and this is their score on a particular topic. And you can see that if they were not using clickers, that's the red thing. This blue thing and white thing is with clickers in 2 different years. And of course, the questions you can keep modifying based upon the kind of feedback you get. So things can get a little bit better over time. but you can clearly see that students perform much better. And this is not in the clicker question. This is on post-test given after the clicker question, okay? And you can see that student performance is better with these clicker questions. I've already said to you that it's really important to do these kinds of interactive simulations and case studies and things like that. Oh, those are called computer simulations of clinical encounters. Have you guys used this? Okay, you have used it. Okay, so medical school has bought this really nice simulation program that you can have students work on outside, and then in the class there can be discussions about those cases, you know, the kinds of things that students were finding difficult. And again, you as an instructor can think carefully about how can I design the in-class thing that would help students with these difficulties that they were having. As I said, in-class activities should be very carefully designed. And if you're making students work in groups, we at least in physics find that a group of 2 to 4 students is optimal. But I just heard that, you know, sometimes groups can be larger here. And if you see that all students are engaged, then there's nothing wrong with that. And of course, homeworks are still necessary on these kinds of things to make students develop self-reliance, because you want each student to be able to do these kinds of things. But after the flipped class, in which you have coached students, provided feedback to them, they've worked with each other and gotten your support, your feedback, your guidance, then they go home and they practice these things on their own in homework, and that way they develop the confidence that yes, they can do it all by themselves, and it helps them an opportunity to solidify concepts. Now, since we don't have time, I just wanted to say one thing, that if you are doing a flipped class, I was going to ask you this question and have you talk to each other, that think, pair, share. But I think we don't have time for think, pair, share. What we are going to do is, I'm just going to tell you that if you are flipping your class, and if you're doing it the way we are doing, for example, in which case you only have in-class thing half the time, and half the time students are outside doing things on their own, right? So instead of 4 hours, we meet with them only 2 hours, and that's all active learning. Students are working with each other based upon all the feedback that we got, based upon the activities that we designed for them. Remember, it's very important that you discuss with students why you have flipped the class. You know, don't think that they will know why it's really, you know, a good thing for them. Because you have to say, look, some of the things that are informational, you know, like some of the things you can learn on your own, but all the things that you're having difficulty with, those are the kinds of things we are going to focus on here. And this is a very important thing to actually discuss with them, and why working with other students is actually a good thing. You know, like we were talking right before this thing, and you know, she was saying that when she teaches, when she has students, other students helping her out, students kind of, you know, challenge their authority. They say, oh, these people are only 2 years, you know, above me. What do they know about this? I think again, having a discussion with your students, that look, discussing it with these other students who have just learned it is a very good way. So you will have some facilitation, not just from, you know, with the instructor, but also with the TAs who might only be a few years before them. That's a good thing, because actually those people will understand your difficulties much better. They will actually facilitate the discussion in a much more meaningful way than somebody who has like 20 years of experience teaching and has forgotten what it's like to be in student shoes and what it's like to have those difficulties. So all of these things need to be actually discussed with students in order to get the buy-in, and in order for students to actually understand the value of the fact that struggling is a good thing. It's okay to struggle in class, because that's really the stepping stone to success. That's the stepping stone to learning, and basically they should really be doing this. And also talking to students that acquiring knowledge, you know, can be done outside, and it's really thinking about how to apply that knowledge in diverse situations, how to develop important skills. That's what we are trying to do in class time, you know, dealing with all the things that actually are difficult. So I think I'm going to just stop here and answer any questions that you might have.
So you mentioned talking to students about the classroom and kind of the rationale of flipping. How do you talk to faculty? So if you've got a course that you're the director of, for example, but you have we physicians are sometimes have trouble changing from a tradition.
So that's a really good question. So he is saying, you know, how do you convince faculty that they should actually use these kinds of approaches in class where students are actively engaged in the learning process, and as in the flip classes? I think that could be a challenging thing, but you know, the more data you collect on how students are doing, say, in a flipped class versus in a traditional class, I think you have more ammunition to actually present to faculty to show that this active engagement, coaching students, you know, scaffolding their learning is a really important aspect. We cannot just, you know, show them how to play soccer and expect that they'll go and, you know, play it themselves, you know, become good at it. We need to be there to guide them as they are practicing those things and provide them with feedback on how to do it, and collect data on student learning in these different kinds of courses using similar kinds of measures. So for example, in physics and a lot of other sciences, now there's a lot of standardized tests and things that you can give to students, which actually also gives you the national data on how students have done on those kinds of tests. And if you look at your students' performance in these classes, which are active learning classes, as in the flipped classes, you know, where students are really actively engaged, they're struggling with things, and then you are helping them think about how to do these things well. If everybody sees that, yes, these data show that students are doing better in those classes, you will be able to actually change some people who actually believe in data, at least. Please.
The time you spend in the classroom with the students is based on the assumption that they have spent time prior listening to what's on the web or whatever you set up. Do you track whether or not students actually do that, or pay any attention to whether they actually prep for the class?
You know, that is a really good question. And remember, I was saying at the beginning of my class, of my lecture, that I don't think I rely on CourseWeb, because unfortunately CourseWeb data is not reliable in terms of how much time students are spending. So when we look at the time students spent, it is not consistent with what students are saying they are doing. And so unfortunately, that data about the time that students are spending is not reliable. The only thing that I can say is that you can look at the MOOC data, because all of that data from MOOC, remember I said that in my opinion, the biggest thing that we are going to learn from MOOCs is how to teach flipped classes, how to teach online classes better, you know, because in MOOCs, all of that data is there, because Coursera, edX, and Udacity, they really have those kinds of things nailed down. They try to track all of those things. Unfortunately, CourseWeb for that purpose is not reliable, so we don't have that data from CourseWeb that I can tell you anything reliably about. But you're right, I mean, that is an important thing. But remember, in order for your students to actually do those things so that they come prepared to struggle in class with the activities that you want them to actually do based upon their feedback, you have to actually have certain amount of course grade on those pre-class activities. So in other words, if you're giving pre-class quizzes like the kind of quizzes I showed you, you should have some grades assigned to them, because if you don't, then people might just blow them off. So it is important to actually say, no, I think that these pre-class activity quizzes are really important. I want to have a significant fraction of my course grade on these kinds of things. It shouldn't be like 1% of your course grade. It should be more than that, so that students actually take these things seriously and they make use of out-of-class time. Also, you can actually use clicker questions in class right when they come to class too. Before you actually put them in small groups to work with each other, ask them like 8 clicker questions or 9 clicker questions that are based upon pre-quizzes, so that, you know, that gives you an additional thing to see what have students done, because those kinds of clicker questions are just based upon what they should have read. And again, based upon the responses to those clicker questions, you will know even better how to summarize those kinds of things, you know, in addition to what you learned from the pre-quizzes. So that's a great point.
I did that for the HEAM course, you know, where we have a series of, the HEAM course is primarily online teaching. It's all recorded, but most of it's recorded anyways. And at the end of each recording, I have quizzes that the students have to go through. And we keep track of when they do them and when they don't do them. And what we found last year was that a large proportion of the class waited until the 2 days before the final exam to go through the quizzes, because they were using them as teaching tools, and they just blew it off. And they although we kept track of the grades and stuff, we didn't grade
Yeah, so that's why I think grading is really important. And remember that study that I was telling you about earlier, where I said that this is a very nice study, and if you are interested, I can send it to you. This is a study that shows that if you actually grade students on the kinds of things that you want students to learn, the kinds of skills that you want students to have, and especially, for example, on these kinds of pre-quizzes, they will learn those things even if they initially at the beginning of the course said, I am not really intrinsically motivated to learn in this course. So that study shows that no, there was no statistically significant difference between those students' performances, whether they said they were intrinsically motivated or not, so long as the grading policy was designed in such a way that students knew that they had to do those kinds of things because they were being graded on those things. So that's a very good point that he made. It would be really good to have grades associated with those kinds of things. Then they will do it, and it's not like they'll cram it at the end. Because again, cognitive science also shows that when you cram things, you might do well in the exam the next morning, but the retention is really poor. The second day, the performance goes down like crazy. People have actually done, studies where they have looked at student performance, like over time when they learned the same thing spread out versus crammed overnight, and they see that there is a big difference in how students retain that knowledge as opposed to this. And if education is about, keeping what you have learned and using it in the future, then it's really important to actually make sure that students are learning throughout. Other questions, comments? Thank you.